Good evening, everyone. This is Rillian for the 2_MK group. Today we'll be looking at KenBot, who has never received a specific disk guidance segment or stream due to being released along with the initial release of our website back in May. So as sort of a reverse introduction, we'll be going into what KenBot is for, how you should use him, and some of the more advanced ways you can use him, especially having seen some stuff in the silver ranks recently that strongly indicates that you should probably learn how to do this regardless of whether or not you're specifically looking for the things that the KenBot was originally built to do. You can still get a little bit out of it if you are not too familiar with dealing with the buttons and approaches that Ken as a character uses. As always, this content will be rebroadcast from the Amara 2_MK channel to our main 2_MK channel with full permission. So we're going to go straight into what KenBot is about and the things that make it capable of doing the particular things that it's for. The main reason KenBot was created was to train someone's agility and the responses to pressure that they use when they are pressed in various spaces and situations. But today we're going to go into more specific aspects of the recordings and why the recordings are the way they are for this bot. Note that similar to the page, which will be cleaned up this weekend, the actual inputs here may differ very slightly from the specific instructions. This is because KenBot is fairly lenient and will allow you to get away with not having the best of execution to input him. There are also some relatively easier inputs. There are also, as you can see here, some variants that happen due to the leniency, and the variants will also be added because of what they cause in terms of different people. So we'll be getting an update to KenBot conceptually in both cases here. The first variant is that despite the fact that the actual bot specifically says that you're supposed to hide a Tatsu in the Hadouken, this variant turned out to be useful and therefore was left alone. The Tatsu is not quite as useful as having him be able to do crouching like kick on landing, whereas he might have done something else before, and it changes his rhythm quite a lot. So if you want to deal with this sort of thing for some reason, you can go ahead and do that. I'll get back into why this is specifically more useful to higher level players than the variant that we have given the lower level players. For lower level players, this is not necessarily the best variant. You will stress yourself out too much, and that's really not going to get you any gains whatsoever. But the only thing needed to be noted here is the fact that rather than finishing the Tatsu, Ken stops at down back and hits the light kick, then there is no Tatsu, and it causes the shift in his movements. Exactly what this does, once again, I'll get back to later. Moving on to his action 2. This can be dealt with in multiple ways as well. And this has some extra inputs in it. However, they're probably not having too much of an impact on anything. The crouching light punch that you see there is really not affecting the game. The fact that he has the standing heavy punch instead of the forward also is not affecting anything. This is a fairly easy input to do. The main difference with this one is that due to the initial difficulty of input, he doesn't actually do something else immediately on landing. He actually does the crouching medium kick every time, and therefore does not do as much run stuff as he normally does. This is also useful as a variant, but this is more so useful as a variant for very specific work when you're playing. It lets you see the medium kick and read that as something that's going to happen, and then lead into that, so that you can time things like that. It's not actually good for training your reactions, because it doesn't really teach you how to handle the character. It mostly teaches you how to react to a move that you could easily have set up yourself. And that's the main reason that we don't necessarily recommend this. However, one useful thing about it is that if that crouching medium kick whiffs and then he goes into a different action, it's actually more useful, which he can do. So this is still functionally a variant, and depending on your goals and your own character, you can use it in different ways. Of course, we never brought this up because at the time, variants seemed like something that we would spend too much time on and that players would not be able to easily get used to. So the upgrades to KenBot to add the variants may be a little bit much, and we'll probably say something specific on that page rather than doing it, or alter it depending on what happens when AE comes out. However, the perfect version of this input is relatively easy to put in. It's just a backwards heavy kick tatsu, bat medium kick, heavy punch, and then down bat medium kick heavy punch. The timing is a little difficult, but I'm showing off the fact that if the timing is a little bit off, it won't necessarily break the bot. It just creates an easier situation for you to use, which you might want to make more effort to clean up later when you're used to dealing with that move in itself. Ken's action 3 is fairly simple. It's based around making sure that he can throw in some quick stuff, and if you fail to punish this move correctly, he'll either get you force you to block, or in some way trick you. Now, since you're supposed to be crouching anyway when this move whiffs over your head, you should be fine. But as you can see, if you're a little too slow on it, you get counter hit, especially if you're trying to use a medium button to do it. And based on, there are basically multiple different situations in which you can get different reactions. If you're too slow but only by a little bit, he blocks. If you're in a different timing, he'll get counter hit. But this is still a good way to learn that counter hits are a thing that you can get when you fail your punish but your opponent meant to hit another button. And similarly, if you're altogether too slow, your opponent counter hits you. This also adds in his throw so that you can see more behaviors and a bit of that, just to show you how bot rhythms change when you actually succeed at what you're supposed to be doing. You then have to worry about something else happening. Bots get functionally stronger when you succeed at hitting them. The input is exactly as seen here. A forward medium kick into a forward heavy kick with a slight delay. It's better not to mash this, but you can. This appears to have a different input, but it's actually more so a plinked throw. You can have the throw go in either direction depending on how you deal with Ken as a character. We chose here to put it as a back throw, but it actually does not matter. And once again, we will clean up the bot page to clarify this. but we didn't want to put specifics of directions that should be held during the throw. Overall though, this is not particularly hard to input, and it will work fairly well even with some of the directions and the timings a little bit off. The main thing you're aiming for is just to create the target combo that can whiff over your head, and then a move with the timing that will hit you. The crouching light kick will be much like that. The throw is a different spacing and a different timing. It's not intended to actually come out regularly. But as you can see in the original form of when you just have the bot restart on his own, which he's about to do, and do absolutely nothing about it, he will in fact throw. He will do this if you do the recording where he hits, and he will also do it if you do the recording in a way where he completely whiffs. But you can throw him off because his rhythm can be changed. So he can get closer, clip you, and then go into a slightly different rhythm, where he no longer tries to throw. It's through this that you can get used to the idea that bots can use different rhythms and different types of move altogether. So moving on to action 4. This is a really simple input overall. On this version, this is actually functionally action 5. So despite the fact that you're seeing 4 on screen, I should have practically turned this off to make it more sensible. We moved this input to action 5 because this is the one that is least required for the bot as a whole. It's also changed up in a particular way as a result, and it lets you see a lot of behaviors that are very strange relative to the game's inputs. For example, the fact that he can do the heavy kick tatsu, even though really we mostly just did a lot of wobbling around and let him have down with the heavy punch, heavy kick, which is normally his V trigger. You see a lot of strange behaviors here, but these aren't strange to anyone who understands bots relatively well. So any push that you have about how you want to create your own or seeing different things in the bots as a generality, you can pay attention to this and learn the sort of things you can get away with doing relatively leniently and cause strange things to come out. This is also the one you're supposed to be able to get rid of if you needed to. So there's not a lot of specifics about how perfect this needs to be. You can easily see that most of what this is about is just throwing out the correct move, making sure the V trigger is hidden, and that's about it. So we're moving back to what would actually be our action 4 in the bot page. It's recorded as action 5 here because, again, we didn't really want to switch it around. But I'm leaving the numbers off, so you should be able to work from there just by seeing what I said rather than what actually shows. When this one starts off, it leads into a dashing in throw. And it has the heavy punch shoryuken hidden within it. But normally, after just a little time, the bot is given the ability to just do this. This version of it also has an up forward in it. But this never has come out in a general sense, and we haven't found any real reason why this is useful to actually keep. It just never comes up to the point where it needed to be changed, so the recording hasn't been specifically perfected. Normally we leave these things in place just in case someone gets the same sort of situation so that we can verify their findings rather than having to specifically try to re-record something that is difficult to get wrong, quote unquote, in the precise way that the player has done so. Overall, this input is intended mainly to give Ken his run and to give him a shoryuken. The final result is a bot that is mainly for dealing with reactions and dealing with being under pressure relative to those reactions for someone who is not specifically well versed in the game itself in terms of data, how to use their punishes, which punishes to use, and things like that. So let's look at some basic ways you can use this to train and combinations of inputs you can use to get new situations out of what's been shown already. We're going to leave off recording slots 4 and 5. 1, because it is slightly confusing, and 2, because they're mostly there so that you can learn to do shoryuken stuff, which most people who are experienced with it will either already have some experience with just by getting hit by anyone, since there are more characters in the game now that easily do this. And there's also an issue where if you've got Ken's specifically, the punishes are a little different from, say, an Akali who also has his own. But at some point, we're far enough into this, both this season and the game, that we're going to presume that everyone who plays it has managed to probably work out their best crush counter combo and has mostly been working on getting that combo done right. Since we have now put this sort of content up to the bronze level, most people have that one way or another. So instead, we're going to combine actions 1 and 2 with the knowledge that specifically the action 1 here is a little different from before, and as I said, the variant is in. This is useful because the specific variant that this gives results in Ken doing a lot more things that are similar to cross-up timings and cross-up spacings than he normally has. He's more likely to jump over your head, but he's not necessarily more likely to attack while doing so. He's also more likely to use the air tatsu because of the fact that his rhythm is different. And this actually makes him slightly more useful as a bot for people who are fighting on this level. He does have this ability naturally. If you combine 1 and 2, even on the regular version, he will be able to do this. It's just that the timing with which he does it is slightly less effective. Very slightly. It's more so that the rhythm causes it to come out earlier in this version than in the other one. And you get a lot more of that situation where he does the light kick and clips you, and then does that. There's also a secondary useful thing, where because of the timing he ends up doing his back medium kick right there. So it's created a mix-up where you aren't absolutely sure where you should block. But you learn after a little while that he will generally do one a particular way and do the other a particular way. So with just these two on, you force yourself to deal with both Ken's cross-up spacing, even though he does not necessarily use good cross-ups, and guarding your legs, figuring out how far away Ken is from you when he tries to do things at your feet, and keeping your mind on which of these reactions you should have. So the bot can be entirely useful with just these two. And noted he's less so when his variant is such that he will actually do the Tatsu, because based on certain timings, he will actually do the Tatsu on landing in such a way that it becomes a problem. The bot is not generally meant to do full damage when it's in this form, it's just helping you get used to certain things. Like, when will this cross up, when will it not cross up? How do I need to block to get out of this situation or get into another situation? If we add action 3 instead, we're generally not going to be turning off action 1 because it's basically required for the thing that you are training with this bot, pressure reactions and anti-airs and so on. What you end up with is a Ken that is willing to jump but has a better, not specifically a cross-up, but buttons that lead to something that looks like a cross-up. At a certain range, he does gain the cross-up, but he doesn't do anything after it, so you don't have to worry that much about it. He also generally tends to have a timing which is actually bad for training it, in that if he jumps after having been blocked, and you are still crouching, he will not actually hit you most of the time. This is to train with less pressure. You don't want to be training with the pressure of constantly feeling like you're losing, but you can still see that you could have been in the same situation. He'll do this, something like that, and then jump. This is how we're going to plan to develop the katas, whereas I can stay crouch blocking and completely ignore this. If I stand block, I must stand block in the right direction. Depending on your character's walk speed, this doesn't always happen. But you get to figure out some information about how far away Ken can be from you when he's trying to do certain things, and how much trouble you'll get into if you try to move in particular ways, ambiguous cross-up spacings and timings. You can just grind on this for a while, and it becomes the kata for understanding Ken's style of play with those very ambiguous cross-ups, whereas Ryu tends to poke you and push you out. Ken does not push you out anywhere near as far, and he does not try to keep you as far away either. So with just these three, you can use certain parts of them in particular ways to get your katas and figure out what button you have to press in what timing to deal with the character based on what your own character does. Maybe you can't do anything at all. If you use just 2 and 3, mostly you'll get this, which is a lot of mix-ups between him doing that from too far away and doing the heavy Tatsu. Our general consensus is that these two combined are basically useless. If you really needed to work on heavy Tatsu reactions, you probably could do it without any of that. However, if I add action 1 back into this mix, different things start to happen very quickly. Now he has the jump back, and the jump range has become very different. The jump range has become wherever he happens to be at that moment, and the jump timing has become less often. So you can no longer rely on him doing a particular thing because he's at this spot, or even doing it because he has just done crouching light kick. These three alone are enough to give you the Ken Kata, which means that anyone who has had the bot before now, if they had the fully correct version without the crouch light kick variant, they probably were missing out a little bit, but for the most part, if you've used this bot before and ever just noticed, okay, he does too many shoryukens, let me turn off some of that stuff, you will have been training against a Ken that is much better at training particular aspects of your reaction and pressure game. However, it is still quite possible that what you need, or needed, had very little to do with that. Perhaps you needed initial work on meaties, and you're looking for meaties that specifically relate to after your crush counter. This is usually a good way for beginners to get a lot of damage, or at least a good understanding of other people's attempts and approaches at meaties. So in this case, since, as I said, the Ashram 4 and 5 are reversed, I won't specifically say which one of them I am turning on in terms of numbers. I'll just clarify it as a concept, namely this concept contains Ken's run. And that is something that you can find yourself needing to get used to. The specific timing he uses for the run varies quite a lot, and depending on whether or not you clip his feet when he does particular things, you'll see more and less of it. Since this bot does not actually do EX Shoryuken, well, EX Shoryuken, which is Shoryuken, you do not actually get the chance to deal with the mix-up that can come after his heavy kick Tatsu. You only get to deal with the part of the mix-up you could do anything about. He does have the ability in this form to throw after a blocked heavy kick Tatsu. But he will do this mostly rarely. So mostly what you're adding is the ability to occasionally punish him, to see your crush counter combos off of that, and to get used to him waking up with either nothing, throw, or a light button maybe. This is actually the original intention with the light kick Tatsu, because as you can see right there at that moment, he would have woken up with light kick Tatsu instead, which is a 3-frame move and deals with a lot of things. Since at the beginning you're mostly dealing with people who don't specifically expect to quick rise or don't necessarily understand what they're doing when they quick rise, he doesn't generally have this ability. We have definitely considered giving it to him, but this does have the chance to make his inputs more difficult. And so most likely if we did anything like that, it would be for a version of him that is meant to be more powerful in a specific way. Whereas anyone who already thinks they should be using KenBot for solutions to their issues with this matchup probably doesn't have that specific problem. Ken's Shoryuken is so incredibly invincible and so long range that you really don't have a good way around that. You just have to either expect he will do it or he won't do it. So with those in mind, let's go into explaining, once again, why it is that the CPU isn't quite sufficient for this job. We're going to use a level 7 CPU because Characters with invincible uppercuts are problematic in that the CPU at higher levels doesn't actually do that uppercut if it believes that you are going to block it. It can read your inputs. You will generally find that it spends much less time doing those things. So you don't get a lot of time to practice your crush counters or similar things. He's not terrifying, but you can see the difference here. I'm not dealing with his jumps in the same timings. I don't have to deal with them. I defend my feet and he does like 1/2 of a combo, puts on pressure, gets out of the way of moves relatively well. But basically the only thing I can really practice at this point is dealing with run and frame traps. You could lower his difficulty level, and that would be the basically obvious thing for someone to do when they first come into the game. The default difficulty level is 4. Okay, I'll see what a level 4 CPU Ken does to me. How afraid do I have to be? What do I need to understand in order to play against this character? But most likely what will happen if you do that is similar to what will happen against the bot, but less focused. He'll just hit you with stuff and you will just hit him with stuff and he won't really be trying to do anything. The CPU at lower levels is not as good as most of our bots because the CPU is not specifically trying to beat you, it's trying not to. So it spends less time doing things, finishing combos, setting up throws, setting up situations, and spends a lot more time moving around on the screen and letting you get used to motion. This doesn't help you when you go into matches against real players at all. Real players have some sort of plan. The plan itself might be horribly unsafe, but if you're not familiar with it because the CPU has never attempted to implement a plan, then you don't know what to do against it and it can become effective against you. Therefore, our aim with the bots, as always, is to create some semblance of a plan, preferably one that is stressful to the player, or helps understand the first order optimal strategy that the character themselves is built around. How likely the person is to do that. But as you can also see, he will backdash out, even at level 4, he will backdash out of things that don't make sense to backdash out of. Meaning that all my throws basically become useful only if he's already started another move and I happen to randomly hit throw and throw be faster than that move. Also, since you cannot see any of the inputs, you have no idea what he was pressing at that moment, and you can't wait for the situation to recreate itself so that you can then see what he was doing. So it is impossible to learn much about frame data either. Coming to the conclusion that, oh, I shouldn't throw this because whatever he's doing quickly stops that from happening, while also never needing to defend against throws yourself because the CPU will do this, is no help to you. Oh, there's one. But let's raise into level 6 and demonstrate the difference in there. Level 6 is where I suggest most people to start. At this point, the CPU will start to use some at least basic strategies, but it mostly uses combos like that and meaties, which does have a decent chance of approximating to a player, but not usually a player who is actually in the upper echelons of bronze, and is certainly therefore zero use to anyone who is in silver but just for some bizarre reason doesn't have much Ken experience. However, since the recreation of scenarios becomes difficult, you can't necessarily try to enact your own plans either. And things that a normal person would block or react to, the CPU does not need to do that, and it will at least take advantage of that much For example, very few people will confirm that. Very few people will beat that. Level 6 is around that spot where you can get them to do random shurikens. But this, in my experience, is mainly just Ken. If you try to do this with Cammy, for example, because you need to learn to practice Ken and spike punishes, you may be at it a while. We'll probably eventually make a variant of Cammy that allows you to practice that, because it can get complicated, especially if, as mentioned in Kansuki Dynasty stream, if they decide to remove crash counters or lessen their effect, it's going to get a little difficult. You'll also note, of course, that there's very little meter use here. So you don't really have to worry about most of those things. And if you're familiar with the general fighting style of Ken's from about 1000 to 3000 rank points, at least at the moment, there would be far more backing off and use of heavy kick tatsu in here. It is that fact that relatively inspired the bot, because it became obvious that the CPU was not going to abuse that move as much as people would, and therefore it would become impossible to get real good data on how to fight it. But rather than continuing in just talking about what the bot is for, and poking at him with Bison, now I will hand this over to Amara, who specifically has a thing to train on. You would have seen earlier in the week, perhaps, there was at least one Ken fight in our Wednesday open mic stream, and that Ken fight was basically the standard. It contained a lot of backing off into use of EX Tatsu, into specific follow-ups that then had to be dealt with. Amara's goal generally, therefore, is to deal with that move while still keeping in mind a lot of the other things Ken can do, and the spacings that Ken ends up at when she does particular things. Because her opponent basically did two things for the entire match, and those two things were not specifically good strategies, but until you've built in your muscle memory and pressure reactions, and gotten used to the idea of someone who does basically the same thing every time, you're not going to get anything out of it. So, after another quick sound check to verify that moving around has not caused anything, the team will report back to me shortly. We'll continue with Amara taking over, switching to Ryu, and practicing the most advanced possible response. So, Amara initially used this and the same thing I mentioned to create what will eventually become available in our Kata's section, namely keeping herself safe depending on where Ken jumped from. But in this case, she has to deal with something else. Variable ranges on Ken's heavy kick Katatsu. In fact, Ken is very good in terms of variable ranges in general. And a 3-part kata is usually sufficient to get this sort of information out of a bot, if you know which ones to turn on and off, which is why we decided to specifically make that information outright available. One example that you can see here is that understanding the range at which you should parry certain jump-ins is required to know which punish you can or should use against those jump-ins. Now, with Ken's constant changing and moving of his space on the ground and his hitboxes, the situation shifts relatively quickly, and you're forced into paying a lot more attention to his spacing than you are paying to what exactly he's doing. If you spend too much time thinking about what he's doing, you won't actually be able to react to the thing you need to in the end. Especially if your response requires any level of execution that can be failed. However, KenBot in this form has at least one option for dealing with nearly everything in the game except some Dalsim stuff. Whether or not he does that is really not relevant, since katas are done similarly to bots. You either give yourself a certain amount of points, or you decide I'm spending a certain amount of time on this action, and you just leave the bot with full health and leave it there. So as you can see, we have Ken doing Tatsu from multiple ranges, and you can use this to learn lots of things about how his Tatsu interacts with your character. For example, if you crouch after the first hit of a close heavy K Tatsu, Ken goes over your head. If you stand after the first hit, usually Ken will not. You are the one with the control over where Ken ends up relative to you. Now, the amount of time it takes for this to happen is quite long enough for the Ken player to also recognize which side they're on. But this still isn't a useless thing to devote your time to. Understanding where Ken will end up can change the fight dramatically, because there are many characters who have trouble punishing Ken when he does go completely over their head. There are other characters who prefer for Ken to go completely over their head because they have some advantage at that range, or some move that reaches him quite far away, but they don't want to deal with the stuff he gets when he lands right in front of them. They want to be able to force a particular thing or bait him, or any number of different things. So having control over whether or not Ken goes over your head, and understanding how to exert that control, and further when you cannot do so because he wasn't close enough at the time he started. All these things are important parts of the Ken matchup at higher levels, but the bot naturally allows you to do this because its kata-based system is built in. So for example, in the case of Ryu, whose main good responses to Ken doing that are to throw him and to parry and hope nothing bad happens, there are definitely timings in which it's better to let Ken go over your head and try to do something about it afterward. Similarly, depending on the player, there are timings where it's better to do the opposite. Simply stand block it if you realize he started from close. Make sure he stays in front, and that then, therefore, you have control of the situation. In Amara's case, for example, she probably is learning as well to parry this move, but she's not learning to just parry the move regardless. There are spaces at which it's best to parry it, because the reaction will put the parry into the right slot of timing. And there are spacings at which it's better to hit it with medium punch Shoryuken, because it's invincible to aerial attacks and you don't have to worry about it. But you have more time, so it's fine. This one move actually has about 6 different reactions. For most characters, you do have to know exactly what you're doing. Do you want to anti-air? Can you anti-air with this particular button at this space? And all those things become very relevant. This is usually what causes us to create a kata to use. Katas are things that are relevant when you need multiple reactions to one thing. Because that is the sort of thing you do have to grind out and that you will not necessarily be able to make very good use of if you don't. Therefore, while simply working on anti-airs is a perfectly valid option for this bot, and getting points is relatively easy, we did originally include a variant that if you wanted to work on a particular thing, you should try to punish the heavy kick Tatsu rather than punishing the Shoryuken. This was because at the very beginning, when we created the bot and recognized the number of different ways it could be used, while we did not want to go into that and confuse anyone, it seemed worth it to hint at it and see who managed to figure out that they could use it for particular things, or just putting that information out there in the interim before we created anything more specific as we intend to do this weekend. So as you can see there, for example, you can deal with him very differently on a parry by knowing how far away he was from you in the air when you parried him. You can make the decision that, oh, I was too ready for that jump in. I wasn't distracted by anything else. I have plenty of time, so I shouldn't necessarily just parry. I should just anti-air. What if they were not setting me up for that? Maybe they're jumping in with the intention of faking me out. So you anti-air them instead. You anti-air them mainly because you have enough time to anti-air them. There are also a few meaties that you can spend some time learning here, but Ken will generally not do anything about them, so it doesn't come up. So learning even small things like your execution, what triggers you mentally when you see it on the screen, which movements of Ken's look like each other and therefore can be confusing. All of these things can improve your Ken matchup ability, even while you're generally focused on the main kata, which is related to things like his crouch, light kick. As of this time, there are actually 6 different katas you can get out of KenBot by turning on and off certain things and knowing which ones do what. So let's demonstrate the simplest one with this variant, in which only action 1 is on. Just 1 and nothing else whatsoever. There is a kata based on just this. Ken will hit you with crouching light kick and then jump over your head. And he'll always punch, which is the downside of this one. It can be altered, but it's usually a problem to do so. But whether or not he punches is not the important thing here. The important thing here is what happens when you try to use your regular anti-air on him. You'll know that he gets hit a lot of the time when he's nearer the ground, and if you mistime it, he doesn't get hit at all. You can see that the game leniency also allows some other stuff to come out that is harder to put into the bot automatically, but it's not really necessary for the kata at all. So every time Ken jumps like that, where he's already been hit with it, or hit with something, it becomes easier to do. But what happens if you purposely let him hit you with the light kick first? The timing's off, as you can see. If you block the light kick, it's easier to figure out where you are. Block stun means a certain thing. You have more time to react to the scenario that's going on than if he hits you or he whiffs entirely. There are specific things that happen if Ken gets to a range at which he doesn't hit you with the light kick at all. It's not easy to reproduce, but you can take my word for it at this point that he changes his rhythm if he gets over. He doesn't actually do anything, and he ends up sort of... If he has V-meter, he'll go into V-cancels, he might do a Shoryuken, all sorts of weird things happen at that point. This isn't particularly difficult to put into a bot either, so getting to the point where this kata becomes possible is usually relatively easy to input. If you're the sort of person who uses Shoryukens to anti-air, it's also a way to practice the advanced cross-cut DP technique and the timing for that. There are two different ways to do it, and you would be able to figure out which of them is your preferred way to do it. Or to do things like that, for example. He also allows you to, once again, work on your ambiguous cross-up responses. But that is in itself the next kata in line, which is achieved by turning on action 3 and mostly doing the same thing. The strength of action 3 is mostly that it restores his ability to do Hadoukens instead of just jumping. And it sets up more spaces in which he changes his own spacing. So you can use it to work on anti-airs, you can use it to look for ground clips, but mostly he will generally be able to do the same things. Now that the game is giving us the ability to turn off the actual playback recording, this is even more useful because you can go from being able to see it all the time and using the number to decide what to do, just mentally prime yourself, to having it off altogether and only identifying things based on what Ken actually does on screen. Recognizing how you tend to move when someone clips you with the move that you block and then does basically nothing and just jumps over your head rather than trying to keep up the pressure is a much better way of figuring out if you have any bad habits in that regard and learning which side Ken tends to land on, while still not generally defeating you quite fast enough that you need to worry about it. But since it is a kata, you could turn off your own health falling, which would solve the problem in most cases, and you can just count in terms of points if your health is on, or just decide, okay, I'm doing this for a certain amount of time, or until I learn something, or I've decided I'm not rusty anymore regarding this particular thing. And you can train yourself to not hit buttons. Any number of those things is possible. And it really doesn't matter which character you play when you do this particular thing. As long as the inputs are reasonably close to right, it shouldn't make any difference at all what your character is. The closer you get them, the more you will see. But most of them are perfectly fine regardless. The reason for this is that the inputs themselves are based on a fairly fundamental Ken strategy. There's usually just a little bit more delay between the fireball and the jump. Fortunately, the specific recording doesn't care. The key to this recording, namely the Action 1, which does the Hadouken into the jump, is that you could delay the jump as long as you wanted. By specifically inputting the other things as part of that hidden, we tended to force the jump to end up closer to particular timings, but depending on what you want to do with it, you could extend it, or you could even cut out certain things and speed it up. There are even slight ways to determine how long Ken takes to jump based on something else entirely. Namely because the block stun of fireballs differs based on not so much how close Ken is to you, but whether or not he cancelled it out of something and so on, which he can do in this form. You'll also note that due to this he does have a back roll, but it's not really that useful. Most of KenBot's back rolls and quick rises come from specifics of button inputs rather than from button combinations. This is fine though because he is a character who has a lot of Shoryuken motions and is very likely to get some of them to happen naturally. Another kata you can generally use is the aforementioned 1+2. Which, depending on the timing of your buttons, is based almost entirely on dealing with air tatsu, because the rhythm of the bot has changed. So you have his overhead, the air tatsu itself, but because of the timing and framing, he's much less likely to just do regular tatsu, because he would need to be on the ground, and the chances of him actually being on the ground and not having just done another move as a result of it, especially with the variant mentioned, is relatively small. So with just the slightest variation, you get Ken who generally won't do heavy tatsu because the preceding action can only ever be action 2 itself or action 1. Which means whenever he's ready to do that, he'll either be recovering from something else or already in the air. Only in the situation where Ken has had the chance to run in at you from full screen is he likely to do the tatsu right then, and that's a good way to practice the tatsu related things from before. You can do this with just action 2 actually, but it gets frustrating. We tested recently to verify that rather than just telling people use these 2 when it wasn't even necessary. After much research, it's fairly clear that if you really want to work on the tatsu stuff, you do need Ken to have action 1 on as well. It keeps things cleaner, and depending on your input, will allow him to do Shoryukens, so that might matter. It also helps because even if you don't give him full V-meter, he is capable of building V-meter, and this restores to him the ability to use both his V-cancel and his V-trigger. And since the frame data for this is slightly different, I believe, in V-trigger, as well as some of the properties of it even when in the air, you get to get that information and figure out how it's working. While still having to be on enough guard, especially if you are the sort of person whose anti-air involves a Dragon Punch motion like that, that you should still have to be ready if he like throws a Hadouken or something. This particular stream is probably not the place for even more complicated katas, but I expect to be seeing some information about that on our site later on in the year, especially when we know more about the intentions of development and whether or not we'll be seeing the removal of certain game mechanics or the adaptation of certain game mechanics. But as you can see for now, with just slight variations, you can create a Ken training partner that is very focused on causing you to do specific things without necessarily being so repetitive that you can get away from everything. Without the pain of being constantly severely punished for every mistake you make. Part of the learning system we are trying to promote is the idea that if you are constantly taking very heavy damage from making a mistake, it can become disheartening and difficult to learn. So, to make things a little less hardcore, you'll note that for the most part, once Ken does hit you, he doesn't do a lot of damage from there. This gives you enough time to learn a lot of your move interactions with the character and is the more matchup related way of using this bot. Having gathered the information recently that you don't really see that much difference in Ken playstyles as yet going up into the silver ranks, we decided that this is probably worth it, not just to us, but to be shared for everyone to try to make use of as they need to. Next week we'll similarly be working on the Ryu Kata, which is well known. I most likely will not be handling that because I'm not the one who normally uses it. The Ryu Kata also requires one or two variants to Ryu Bot, and as such, that information will also be released on the Sunday as usual in our timing, even though there again will be no new bot to use. And if you've already gotten through most of that, you really don't need to add it to your repertoire. So since there is less specific to discuss, we'll be bringing the stream to an early close tonight. Stay tuned in case we are also hosting the traveling controller stream from Balance Patch But for now, you can find our bots at 2-mk.org, and you can expect an updated, cleaned up, and plus variants KenBot, and a minor description of the katas you can use for KenBot, possibly on a separate page, at our website 2-mk.org. This has been Brilliant with help from Amara, demonstrating for 2_MK. Thank you for watching. Good night, everyone.